Witam Państwa serdecznie, Błażej Hrapkowicz. Jesteśmy na 24. Międzynarodowym Festiwalu Filmowym Camerimage w Bydgoszczy. Our guest is the director, Atom Egoyan.
Hi.
Hello, how are you?
I'm really good, yeah.
One of the main themes which is associated with your work is the theme of trauma or, psychological burden that your characters have to come to terms with. How do you try to translate this trauma, this psychological burden into visual language of cinema? How do you approach it?
That's a really good question. I mean, the film that we're showing here, it's a very different approach than most of my work. This film is more straightforward. We're following a character. We think we understand what his trauma is, but we find out at the end of the film that it's something completely different. But the visual language that we were using for Remember is very uncharacteristic. It's more direct. It's more based on the performance and harnessing a camera approach which is able to focus on that. In my other films, I'm really dealing with this question of how our sense of time is shifted, how we are repeating certain moments over and over again, how trauma comes back to haunt us. But the viewer is directly implicated in this process because of the way the story is told. And the camera seems to have both a very, almost a distant approach in terms of trying to observe where these people are. But I'm using then music and sound effects to enter into the consciousness of the characters and through the viewer as well. It's, I think a lot of the feelings of the film, it's almost of a fragmentation or refraction, that scenes seem to kind of reflect off of each other and ripple through the experience of watching a film.
Yeah. Do you believe that this fractured narrative is a very useful tool to reflect a fractured mind of someone who has been through trauma?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think the characteristic of that is that someone is very often playing scenes over and over again in their mind, that there's almost a ritualized aspect to that, and that often the people think that they have found some way to deal with the trauma, but they are in fact extending it, and the grief becomes more exaggerated. But you mentioned exotica, that there's, when people try to heal themselves or medicate themselves through a certain activity, that can elaborate and kind of sustain the trauma. I don't want it to become a formula, so that's why with this film I took a completely different approach, because it's you don't want to repeat yourself, but I feel most comfortable when I'm writing to use cinema that way. Cinema, it creates this immediacy, so to use the immediacy to kind of pull away and to examine our relationship to what is immediate or what we think is immediate is very interesting. It seems to be almost a sculptural, a way of using the time. I mean, I'm using Tarkovsky's famous expression of sculpting in time, but cinema really does allow that possibility.
Many of your films they deal with very real and realistic issues, like trauma, but their language is very poetic in a way. Like, for example, one of my favorite images from your cinema, the spiders in the Sweet Hereafter. So do you believe that visual poetry is somehow another useful or very appropriate tool to get us into the drama of these people, of these characters? Well,
again, it's trying to create images that will have this they rest with you and you have to digest. As you're watching or you're hearing, you're processing, and you're aware of that there's a self-consciousness. You're aware of your place as a viewer. It's not something you're just prepared to accept. It needs, it creates associations. And that you're aware that there's different structures, that those associations are something that might be contained or resolved within the story, but very often it's outside of the story. And you need to look at something that's happened to the characters outside of any temporal moment that's being visited in the film. And very often you're placed...
So it works on a different level.
Yeah, and also where you're placed in terms of how that story is told. I mean, that particular story that you're saying, the spider story, you're placed in a character's point of view, very directly. But it's almost it's an impossible point of view, and it's also it's elaborated. I mean, the very act of how it's filmed and the way the light works, the positioning of a knife against a child's head, or there's something. It's real, as you said, but it's also heightened. It feels that it's
hyper real.
Hyper real. Yeah. And that play between what's hyper real and what's naturalistic or what's dreamlike. I mean, those are very interesting states to investigate. And cinema is very adept at being able to do that. It's almost designed to do that. The instrument of the camera is designed to give us that. The moment, there are films that you say are extremely natural, but they're not. I mean, this is why I think very often when we see dream sequences in films, they don't seem to fit, or they seem odd, because in fact it's possible that the entire language that we have of cinema, like where we have this idea of the line that cannot be crossed, the way things are cut, that this is actually the way we might be dreaming. It might have been a language that we inherited very, very soon from the birth of cinema. I mean, of all the art forms, when you think about it, cinema hasn't changed that much. So the grammar is essentially the same. If you look at how music changed with tonality, when you look at how painting changed with the ideas of perspective. I mean, cinema from the very beginning had a very rigid structure of how the visual ideas were expressed. Why is that? How did we understand that so quickly? And I think it is because, and we'll never know maybe, but it is the language of how we dream.
But there's also this conventional way, on the one hand, to show dream sequences that are very much apart from, there's a real life, we get this visual signal that this is a dream. And this is very conventional and very simplistic in a way. In your films, it's all, intertwined. We don't see a very sharp edge between these two worlds.
No. And that's, again, because the camera gives us that ability to slip into these things effortlessly. As long as it's not just the camera, but it's the way, the alchemy of it works with the composition, the music. Certainly the sound design is very important. The gesture of the camera is very important. But yeah, you don't have a lot of scenes where people wake up and we realize that we were in a dream. No, that doesn't very. You're inhabiting that space very, very clearly.
Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you.